Snow fell the way silence sometimes does, slow, deliberate, and full of meaning. Each flake drifted through the pale air like a memory refusing to die, covering the tired town of Whispering Hollow in a hush that made even the church bell sound like a secret. The horizon had swallowed the sun hours ago, leaving the world dim and aching, a place where light seemed too shy to stay. Through that muted whiteness came a stagecoach, its wheels crunching over frostbitten earth. When it stopped in front of the general store, the driver jumped down, lifted a trunk, and muttered a name as if it were a burden. Clara May Hollister. She stepped out with care, her boots sinking into the snow like she was afraid to disturb it. Her coat was too thin for the mountain cold. Her gloves had holes that let winter bite her fingers. She paid the driver with the last coins she owned, watched him vanish down the road, and suddenly, she was alone. Just another rumor waiting to be told in a town that lived off whispers. The first thing she noticed was the stillness, the kind that follows loss. Windows flickered with amber light, laughter leaking faintly from behind them. She stood outside, breath ghosting before her, and felt what she'd been running from finally catch up. A bell tinkled as she entered the general store. The warmth hit her like disbelief. Two women stood by the counter, their shawls heavy with snowmelt. They stopped talking the moment she walked in. The shopkeeper, a kind-eyed man with a salt and pepper beard, smiled politely but not warmly. Whispering Hollow was small. Newcomers were examined the way wounded animals were, curiously but from a distance. "New in town?" he asked. "Just passing through," she lied. Her voice was soft, cracked in the middle. He nodded toward the notice board where a few faded advertisements curled at the edges. "There's a cabin for rent. Old Silas Wren's place. He don't use it in winter." She thanked him, bought a loaf of bread, and left before the women could finish their staring. But she could feel it. Already, the air around her carried her story, or at least what people would make of it. The cabin sat at the far edge of town, beyond a line of leafless aspens that creaked like bones in the wind. It was small but solid, the kind of place meant for a man with no patience for comfort. She swept out the dust, lit the old stove, and sat on the floor with her bread and the steady rhythm of fire. When she closed her eyes, Denver returned. The echo of children's laughter in a classroom, the smell of chalk dust, the soft clink of her wedding ring against the desk. Then her husband's words, "You can't give me what I want, Clara. What's left of us?" She had thought leaving would save her from hearing it again. But words like that follow a woman. They live in her bones. By morning, the wind carried gossip down from town, thin voices slicing through the frost. They called her the barren teacher. She heard it first from the widow Martha Cobb at the well, whose smile was all kindness until it wasn't. "Poor thing," Martha said, lowering her voice just enough to be heard. "Some women are meant to care for others' children, I suppose." Clara said nothing. Shame had a way of teaching silence better than manners ever could. Days slipped by like pale ghosts. She began walking to the schoolhouse ruins at the edge of town, sweeping out the snow, arranging the benches though no children came. It was easier to pretend she was still needed. Then came the blizzard. It started one afternoon with a wind so sharp it felt alive, the sky dimmed to slate, and the air filled with a furious flurry that erased the horizon. Clara was halfway back to her cabin when her horse stumbled and went down hard. She tugged at the reins, pleaded softly, but the animal wouldn't rise. The wind stole her words. Snow clawed at her face. When she realized she couldn't save the horse, she sat beside it, pressing her hands together to keep them from shaking. She told herself it would pass, that storms always do. But deep down, she wasn't sure. That was when she saw him. A wagon creaked out of the white, drawn by two dark horses with frost in their manes. The driver was tall, broad-shouldered, his hat rimmed with snow. He pulled to a stop, studying her in the wordless way men of the plains often did. "You'll freeze to death out here," he said finally, voice low as thunder far away. "I was nearly home," she murmured. "You're a mile off course." He climbed down, his movements calm, certain, as if the storm itself obeyed him. Without asking, he lifted her into the wagon. She wanted to protest, but her lips were too cold to form words. When she woke, firelight flickered across rough-hewn walls. A kettle hissed softly. The man, Silas Wren, she later learned, was setting a blanket over her. His beard was dusted with gray, his eyes the color of the land after rain. "Thank you," she whispered. He only nodded, poured her tea, and set it beside her without meeting her gaze. Silence filled the room like music waiting to be played. For 3 days, the storm held the world captive. They spoke little. Silas worked quietly, fixing the shutter, tending to the animals, chopping wood until his breath steamed in the air. Clara mended a torn sleeve of his coat as repayment, her hands trembling slightly. The sound of the fire became their conversation, the steady proof of life. She watched him from time to time, the way he moved without hurry, like someone who had already made peace with loneliness. There was a sadness to him that mirrored her own, though his seemed older, quieter, almost tender. One night, she woke to find him standing at the window, staring at the snow. "You miss someone," she said before she could stop herself. He didn't turn. "Everyone misses someone out here." She wanted to ask who. Instead, she said, "I used to teach children, back in Denver." He looked over his shoulder, waiting for more. "They let me go when they learned I couldn't have any of my own." The words fell softly, like confession. Said a woman like that shouldn't teach what she couldn't understand. For a moment, there was only the crackle of fire. Then he stepped closer, eyes reflecting its glow. "Sounds like they didn't understand much at all," he said. She looked down, fingers tightening around her cup. "You don't have to pity me." "Didn't say I did." He went back to his chair, pulled off his gloves, and stared into the flames. "I've buried more than I've ever borne. Doesn't make my heart any emptier." She glanced up. "You've lost someone too?" He nodded once. "Wife and son. Fever took 'em. Been years, but the quiet stayed." The room felt sacred then, as if the walls themselves bowed to their shared loneliness. He leaned forward, the fire lighting the lines on his face. "You said you can't have children." She nodded slowly. He gave a faint smile, gentle, almost wistful. "Good," he said, voice low and steady. "I've got enough love for both." It was not flirtation, not comfort, just truth, spoken like a man who had carried love too long without anywhere to set it down. Something inside her shifted. A long-held breath finally released. She didn't answer, couldn't. But when she looked toward the window, the storm had eased. The snow was still falling, but softly now, like forgiveness. That night, she dreamed of warmth. Not the kind that burns, but the kind that stays. And when morning came, the world outside her window was washed clean, pale light spilling across the hills like promise. She stood at the door as Silas hitched his horses. "You'll be all right now," he said. "I think so," she replied, and meant it. He tipped his hat, started down the trail, and for the first time since leaving Denver, Clara felt something stir in her chest. Not joy exactly, but its beginning. The wind had softened, the snow sparkled, and somewhere between the creak of his wagon wheels and the whisper of the pines, she heard it, the faint sound of her heart learning how to thaw. She closed the door behind her, leaned against it, and smiled into the quiet. The fire hummed low, steady. Outside, the winter held its breath, as if waiting for whatever would come next. The storm had passed, but the hush it left behind seemed deeper than before, as if the world were waiting to see who had survived. Days moved with the unhurried grace of a thaw. The snow melted in ribbons along the fences, and the sound of dripping water filled the spaces where silence once lived. Clara swept her cabin floor, though it was already clean, her hands restless with something she couldn't yet name. She had not seen Silas since that morning he left. Still, she found herself setting an extra cup on the table, out of habit or hope. She couldn't tell which. The town felt different when she walked through it now. The air carried her name more softly, though still it carried it. Martha Cobb watched her from behind her curtain, the lace trembling like it too had something to whisper. Men at the blacksmith's nodded politely, eyes cautious but curious. Even the children, once shy of her shadow, began following her halfway down the lane, daring to wave before running off again. Whispering Hollow was slow to forgive, but it had a short memory when winter gave way to spring. One afternoon, Clara saw Silas outside the mercantile, loading supplies into his wagon. His sleeve was torn. His hat, tilted against the sun, revealed the silver threaded through his hair. He looked older somehow. Or maybe she just saw him differently now. Less as a man of mystery, more as one who had learned to live alongside his sorrow instead of beneath it. "You're mending well," he said when he saw her. "So are you," she replied. He smiled faintly, his gaze steady in that unhurried way of his. "You should come by the ranch this Saturday. There's a gathering, music, food, some laughter if we're lucky." She hesitated, her heart flinching at the thought of so many eyes. "I don't know if I'd be welcome." "Let 'em talk," he said, tossing a bag of flour into the wagon bed. "They'll find someone else to whisper about soon enough." She almost laughed, though her voice caught in her throat. "You have more faith in people than I do." "I don't," he said, climbing up into his seat. "But I've got faith in you." The words lingered long after he rode off, as if the wind had chosen to keep them. By Saturday, the air had softened into something close to warmth. The snow was still piled along the edges of the fields, but the roads glistened wet with melt. Clara stood before her mirror, fussing with the ribbon on her dress. She hadn't dressed for anyone in years. Her hands trembled as she tied the knot. Not from vanity, but fear. Of being seen, of being misjudged again, of letting herself care Eli and Rosie. The two orphans she had taken under her quiet wing knocked at the door. "Miss Clara," Rosie said breathlessly, "are we still going?" She looked at their faces, thin, bright, hungry for belonging, and something inside her steadied. "Yes," she said softly. "We're going." The Wren Ranch stood proud against the hills, its fences mended, its barn lanterns glowing like captured stars. Music drifted from inside, fiddle and laughter, the clatter of boots on wood. For a moment, Clara froze at the threshold, aware of the sudden hush that followed her arrival. Conversations dipped. Eyes turned. Martha Cobb's voice was the first to cut through. "Well, I'll be. Didn't think she'd show her face here." Clara's breath faltered, but Silas appeared before she could turn back. "You came," he said simply, offering his hand. "I wasn't sure I should." "Then it's a good thing you didn't listen to yourself." He led her inside, their fingers brushing like a secret. The warmth was overwhelming, the smell of roasted meat, pine smoke, and spiced cider. People watched, some curious, others wary. But Silas didn't seem to notice. He poured her a cup, guided her toward the fire, and in that small act made the room less cruel. A song began, slow and sweet, the kind made for two people who didn't need to fill silence with words. He asked her to dance. She shook her head, heart pounding. "I haven't danced in years." "Then it's overdue." He drew her close, not too close, his hand gentle at her waist. They moved awkwardly at first, her boots catching on his. But then the rhythm found them, soft as breath. The music faded beneath the sound of her own pulse, and for the first time she felt herself seen. Not for what she lacked, but for what she still carried. When the song ended, she expected the room to return to its whispers. Instead, there was laughter, applause, even a few smiles. But Martha was watching, lips pursed, eyes gleaming like a knife waiting for use. Later, as Clara helped serve food, Martha approached, voice dipped in honey. "Quite a sight, you two," she said. "Though it seems cruel, doesn't it? A man like Silas wasting himself on a woman who can't give him a family." Clara stiffened, the ladle trembling in her hand. "You don't know him," she said quietly. Martha leaned closer. "Oh, but I know men. They say they don't mind, until they do." Before Clara could reply, Silas's voice came from behind them. "You say too much, Martha." The widow turned, startled. "I was only spreading what you can't carry yourself," he said. His tone wasn't harsh, but it cut clean. "If kindness is too heavy for you, best you stay quiet." The room went still. Martha flushed crimson, muttered something about propriety, and slipped away. Silas looked at Clara then, eyes soft with apology. "Don't let her words stick. She's never known the kind of love that doesn't need proof." Clara swallowed hard. "And you have?" He didn't answer, only smiled, a small, tired curve that said more than words could. Later that night, as the last song played and lanterns dimmed, a shout broke through the laughter. "Fire, the orphan barn." Everything blurred. People rushed outside. Flames licked the horizon, fierce against the night. Clara didn't think. She ran, skirts catching on snow, breath burning her lungs. The barn was a torch, heat slamming against her face. Inside, she heard crying. Eli and Rosie, trapped behind a fallen beam. Without hesitation, she plunged in. Smoke clawed her throat, sparks biting at her skin. She found the children huddled in a corner, dragged the beam aside, her strength rising from somewhere wild and wordless. "Hold on to me!" she gasped, wrapping them close. She pushed toward the door, but a crash above sent fire raining down. Silas appeared through the smoke, his coat aflame at the edges. He lifted the children first, passing them into waiting arms outside. Then he came back for her. She tried to protest, "Go!" But he only shook his head. "Not without you." When they burst through the doorway, the cold hit like salvation. She collapsed into the snow, coughing, the world a blur of orange and blue. Silas knelt beside her, pressing his coat around her shoulders. "I just want it to be enough," she whispered, voice thin as thread. He took her hand, his rough palm trembling. "You always were." She tried to smile, but tears slipped through the soot on her cheeks. Around them, the town worked in silence to put out the fire, and for once, no one looked at her with pity. Only awe. By dawn, the flames were gone. leaving behind the smell of smoke and something new. Respect. Martha brought her tea without meeting her eyes. The sheriff tipped his hat. The children clung to her like she was the reason the sun rose again. In the days that followed, Silas came often, mending what the fire had broken, though the real repair had already begun. The townsfolk stopped whispering. They started greeting. And when Clara stood before the new schoolhouse, a gift built by hands that had once judged her, she felt something deep inside settle into peace. One evening, as the first buds of spring appeared, Silas rode up the hill where she stood watching the sunset. "Looks like the winter finally gave up," he said. "Maybe it just learned when to rest," she answered. He dismounted, standing beside her, hat in his hands. The sky bled gold and rose across the valley. "I never thanked you," she said. "For what?" "For seeing me when I couldn't." He smiled, that same quiet curve that had first undone her. "Wasn't hard," he said. "You were shining the whole time. Just needed someone to notice." The light touched their faces like a blessing. The town below shimmered, reborn. Sometimes, years later, she would tell this story to her students when the snow began to fall. How winter can take everything but never love. How grace often wears the shape of an ordinary man's kindness. And if you're listening now, wherever you are, remember this. No heart stays frozen forever. Sometimes, all it takes is another soul who dares to stand beside you in the cold and say, without fear or demand, "You are already enough." If this story warmed something quiet in you, stay with us a little longer. There are more Wild West tales waiting, filled with hope, forgiveness, and the kind of love that outlives the winter. Subscribe and keep the fire lit.